Thank you very much, Simon. Can I just say, Simon, what a great job you've done on keeping us all meeting and together over the past year, and Forum TV is a great initiative. So thank you, and I'm delighted to support it, and Audley is delighted to support it in this way today. Also really delighted to be able to introduce David Gauke to Forum. In some ways, David and I used to work together, though that always feels a bit like a fraud, because much whilst David was sitting at the cabinet table making decisions, I was very much in the row behind, just listening to those decisions being made. But David is a long-standing member of the Treasury team under David Cameron and George Osborne, and then moved on to be Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and then Lord Chancellor of a grand title and Secretary of State for Justice in Theresa May's government. So he's a good, loyal member of the Conservative Party, at least until 2019, when he stepped down from government. Whether he left the party or the party left him might be something we'll come on to later, David, if we may. But welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
And we're going to talk about, just reflect on the budget, and there are some really big themes, I think, that we could pick out that we'll come to in a moment. I just wonder if, just briefly, for people on the call, you could just take people inside number 11 Downing Street and inside the Treasury as a budget is put together, and just give us a sense of how that works. I always remember the Chancellor coming down to meetings in number 10 with this big bit of paper that was called the scorecard, and trying to sort of navigate that, and that's really the core document. I just wonder if you bring that to life briefly for people on the call, if you would.
Yeah, I was, no, thank you, Chris, and a pleasure to join you. I was in the Treasury for 7 years, and in that time, I think we did 9 budgets and 7 autumn statements, and they were the big events for the Treasury. Everything worked up towards what was described as these fiscal events. Essentially, you would start off with working out what your fiscal ambition was. What are you trying to do? What's the level in which you're trying to reduce the deficit or control the debt or whatever it might be? So you're working on a target. You've got the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is producing various iterations of fiscal forecasts. So that's the backdrop in which you're working. And as those OBR numbers change, so various measures might drop in or drop out and so on. You'll also have certain objectives. What are the things that you're trying to do with this budget? Is this a budget for jobs, or what are you doing with it? And you will have a long list of measures, whether they are revenue raisers to meet your fiscal targets, whether they are giveaways to fulfill some other purpose. You've got those long list of measures, and as you work through them, various ones get eliminated. So if you're looking at revenue raisers, which is what I used to do spend a lot of time working on potential tax rises, as you go through the process, you'll start dropping some, you'll start prioritizing, and eventually the list of measures narrows down. You'll have some engagement with number 10, which the Treasury tends to hate doing, as you'll remember.
We always used to love it.
Yeah, I know. It was the sort of attitude in the Treasury from officials was when the Prime Minister and number 10 wanted to sort of have a say on the budget or just have details of it, was what's it got to do with them? So there would always be some resistance, and that wasn't necessarily personal to particular chancellors. That's just the institutional view. But eventually you'd share this, depending upon the nature of the relationship between number 10 and number 11, you'd share this and you'd reach a final conclusion. A little bit earlier than used to be the case. I mean, I think back in the sort of Gordon Brown days, these things would be finalized on the Tuesday evening, but because you had to get you now have to get everything to the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, at least the final decisions on the sort of Friday beforehand, but most of the big decisions well before that. It's a more orderly structure. You kind of ended up with your final package. The Chancellor announces on the day.
Absolutely, and yes, I remember that process. And so, on that point, just at a sort of macro level, what was the number one thing the Chancellor Rishi Sunak was trying to do with this budget? What do you think his primary message was?
Well, in a way, I think there's two things, and you can't separate them. The first was about continued support as we come out, as the economy recovers. So you had a continuation of a lot of the previous measures, the furloughing regime where we can continue to pay people's wages, the continuation of the uplift in the universal credit, the welfare system, business rates, holiday, etc., etc. So all of that essentially continued. And then the second part of it was about, if you like, establishing fiscal credibility, about reducing the deficit, not to repay the debt that we have accumulated over the last 12 months, but just to make sure that our debt as a proportion of GDP doesn't continue to rise. So in that sense, relatively modest. On economic grounds, he probably didn't need to do any of the second part, because the markets aren't putting us under great pressure. We're getting our debt away, debt interest rates remain very low. But I think the conclusion, and I think he's right about this, by the way, his conclusion was if he was going to take steps to get the deficit under control, it was better to do this now, whilst also announcing the continuation of lots of goodies, so that he just didn't have a sort of punishment budget to deliver later on. And the politics drove the timing as to the measures to try and get the public finances on a sounder footing.
But a sort of pretty fundamental difference to maybe the outlook when you served in the Treasury with George Osborne, when again the deficit was driving decision making, but certainly the Osborne Treasury decided austerity was the thing. It was all about sort of squeezing public spending, and that sort of route. Rishi Sunak, though, is widely seen as rejected Osborneomics and sort of cast his own path. And what does that tell us about where the Conservative government is heading?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, actually, if you look at the numbers and you look at what the IFS and indeed the OBR have said subsequently, it's still pretty tight on public spending. But to give a sort of sense of proportion, the Osborne fiscal consolidation, 80% came from public spending and 20% came from tax rises. What Rishi has set out has been 60% on tax rises, 40% on spending. And I think most people think, certainly this is my view, is that he is likely to come back, loosen up on spending because the pressures are so great, and come back for a second round of tax rises unless the economy bounces back more strongly, and it's not necessary. And there's lots of things that are driving that. And partly public opinion has changed. After 10 years of tight spending control, I think there is a different public appetite now. So I think that makes an important difference. And the Conservative Party recognises that. I also think if you look at where the votes went to the Conservative Party in the 2019 general election, they hoovered up a lot of traditional Labour seats, people who are generally sort of centre-left economically, but culturally quite right-wing. And they voted on a kind of get Brexit done manifesto. That's what they wanted to deliver. And those voters aren't, they didn't support the Conservatives in 2010 or 2015 when austerity was seen as sort of flavour of the month. So I think there's a sort of bigger political point as well. But just on a sort of practical level, public spending has been tight for 10 years. There isn't much fat there to cut. I think most. As a hawkish chief secretary to the Treasury and has responsibility for controlling public spending, I think it's going to be really hard for the government to deliver on the spending plans they currently have. I think they'll probably end up having to spend a bit more.
Right, just how you end up offering the NHS workers a 1% pay rise, and no doubt probably have to U-turn on that at some point in the near future, I would imagine.
Exactly. There's already pain that is apparent from where they're from where they are, and they haven't at the moment, the spending plans, there isn't very much money to go into kind of a recovery, for public services to recover from COVID, if you like. So that we're going to have a backlog on cancer cases, mental health cases. We're going to need to build resilience in the NHS for future pandemics. That all of that's pretty expensive. Education got a huge catch-up job. We haven't done very much for a year. There's going to be some costs involved in that. And I think there's some pretty widespread skepticism that they're not going to have to dig deep into their pockets to find some more money. The hope is that there'll be better than expected economic growth. If you look at the ABR, I think is still reasonably cautious.
Yeah.
So there is hope that we won't necessarily have to have further swinging tax increases, but I think public spending is going to have to increase.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's look at, if we could, some of the particular measures and maybe some of those tax increases, where they're going to fall. I'm just thinking in the context in particular that next week the government's going to publish the integrated review, which is the long-awaited review into sort of our defence and security approach, and that's all going to be about global Britain. And this has been part of the government's narrative since I was in Number 10, and something that they talk about a lot. So that's the positioning. But one of the key measures in the budget was the corporation tax change. So under George Osborne and yourself, it was dramatically reducing corporation tax levels, so that we were way ahead in terms of the G7. Rishi Sunak announced an increase to 25% by 2023, so a real dramatic reversal. I know George Osborne's been quite critical of this, and I wondered what you think about that measure, but also how it speaks to that global Britain agenda.
Yeah, I think it's a great pity. I can see why it happened, because the Conservatives ruled out increasing the three big taxes, or the tax rates, at least for income tax, national insurance contributions, and VAT. And you look around and what's left. And I think they clearly also took the view that better to have a few big increases than have lots of small or medium-sized tax increases. And again, politically, that's probably right. It's politically deliverable, but I think we're essentially going to give up one of the advantages that the UK has over competitors at a time when there are some challenges. There's no getting away from this because of Brexit. It is harder to trade with the European Union than it was previously. I mustn't try and take it personally, because I was the junior minister that brought the corporation tax rate down. We did it for a reason. It was about sending a signal to the rest of the world that the UK was open for business. It was about giving us a competitive advantage. It was about ensuring that there was a better rate of return on investment compared to other places. You look at what the ABR has said. They've identified the risk. There is going to be a lower rate of return on capital investment in the UK as a consequence. It's a pretty static costing, so I think there are a lot of risks that they won't get anything like the money that they think they will, and it does, in my view, send an unfortunate signal. The counter argument, to be fair, is look, you cut corporation tax, but we didn't see a boom in business investment since 2010, which is true, and one has to acknowledge that. But of course, business investment took a heck of a hit after the referendum result in 2016. And yes, low corporation taxes, in my view, can help, but in a period of great uncertainty, they'll have their benefit will be limited. But I think in the longer term, it would be a real advantage to the UK to be competitive on that front. So I think it's a pity. And also I think it does perhaps demonstrate that the sense of being on the side of business is not as big a priority with this government as one might expect from a Conservative government, to be frank.
Yeah, and I suppose the other argument that Rishi would make is that yes, they had to do that, but we're still or the lowest, or one of the lowest in the G7. But on the flip side, there was also this super deduction policy, which was seen as very pro-business. There's the free ports policy, which again is pitched as a pro-business thing. Do you think though initiatives like those sort of outweigh the sort of reputational hit we're going to take as a result of the corporation tax reversal?
I don't, I confess. I mean, first of all, on the point of the lowest rate in the G7, bear in mind that corporation tax isn't just about the rate; it's also the base. And we actually broadened the base, so made capital allowances less generous, the loss relief less generous. But that was part of it. But we felt it was still worthwhile to bring the rate down. In terms of, and really, we should be more ambitious. I don't want to be rude to anybody watching this, but we should be more ambitious than having a better corporate tax regime than the French. I mean, that just isn't. That is a notorious weak point of the French offer, and we shouldn't be setting that as a benchmark. Secondly, in terms of the super deduction, I mean, BBR's view, and I feel this is right, investment. I think there's a lot of dead weight, so it's really good news for BT because they were going to do a lot of investment in plant and machinery over the next couple of years in terms of the rollout of full fibre. But I'm in terms of sort of long-term behavioural impact, given that this is for 2 years only, I'm really not convinced by it. I have to say, but I mean, let's see, and maybe they'll make it permanent. And on free ports, again, a lot of the evidence suggests that what happens with free ports is that it displaces activity to those areas that have been chosen, but away from those areas that haven't been chosen. And in terms of genuinely adding to the aggregate size of the economy, I'm not sure it's going to prove to be that much of a success.
No. Okay. So I think what we're exploring is how the Conservative Party philosophy, I suppose, has changed over this time. And to the point about free ports, in a sense. So these are the 8 ports that they've announced where it would be sort of lower taxes, lower regulations for business to invest. But actually, in the way those were chosen, I know that the Chancellor's had a bit of stick generally for this budget for allocating things to areas that one could argue is either economically deprived, or someone else could argue maybe voted Conservative or have elections coming up where we might want people to vote Conservative. But in terms of how those decisions are made, when we were working in government, there was a lot of talk around industrial strategy, and that was a big focus certainly of Theresa May's time in office. But the government has just now abolished the Industrial Strategy Council. So again, a shift there. How would you characterise that shift in philosophy for the government?
I think, in a way, the Free Ports announcement and the abolition of the Industrial Strategy Council could be described, to coin a phrase, as sort of taking back control by ministers. So rather than having sort of outside bodies have a kind of a particular strategy, they want to be able to make decisions on a case-by-case basis. Now, I think there are some real dangers with this. I think there are some political risks that you find yourself in a sort of quagmire of allegations and of public money being used to favour particular areas that, as sort of US viewers would know all about accusations of sort of pork barrel politics. Are we going to head in that direction? And that's obviously not a great way of spending public money. But I think it is the case that ministers want to be able to make decisions and get the political rewards, if you like. We will, this area we're determined is going to prosper. So Teesside, for example, where there are mayoral elections this May, is very much sort of flavour of the month, and quite a lot of things going into that. And I think there's a hope that the sort of a grateful populace will reward the government accordingly. But there, it's really quite interventionist. there's much more of a sense of, we, the government, want to be able to use levers to ensure that particular activities are performed in particular places. And that's where we go. So it's certainly a less market orientated view of the economy. It's a big state or bigger state view, but with much more discretion than perhaps the Industrial Strategy Council would have, that would have a kind of more, well, this is what we're seriously wanting to do, and this is how we're going to go about it. And it's, although it's got its political risks, it's very much tied in, I think, with a political strategy of the Conservative Party winning over medium-sized and small towns in the north of England and the Midlands, places that tended to vote Conservative for the first time in 2019, voted for Brexit in 2016, but had previously generally been Labour voting, and there is a determination to turn those areas blue.
So Chris, David, thank you so much. Very, very interesting. We've got a number of questions here in the chat box. I'm going to go straight to them. We have 7 or 8 minutes in which to answer those questions. I'm going to come to Peter Osborne first. Peter, can you unmute yourself, please?
I think I've done that.
Yeah. My goodness, you look like a DJ, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's my alternate career. So I've got sort of 2 questions. The one is in the Spectator this week, there was an article on inflation saying that would completely unbundle Rishi to driving through the recovery is one. And then the second point is the point on Osborne's corporate tax reduction. As a businessman, I can tell you that had no impact on me, because while he was reducing the corporation tax, he was removing all the other benefits aside with that. So the net result was basically, from my perspective, 0.
On the inflation point, very good point. And I think it's one that Rishi is very well aware of. And one can draw an interesting comparison between what the UK is doing versus the US. There's much more of a concern about inflation. And the point here being, if interest rates go up, the way our debt is structured and with QE and so on, there was a hope, people used to say till quite recently, well, the UK's debt is sort of, it's got long maturity dates, we've got plenty of time to respond. It now looks as if we don't, because of the way QE operates. So that is definitely a concern. And that's why he wants to demonstrate some sort of fiscal credibility, and he wants to stabilise the debt. And of all, on the risk of things where it could all go wrong, one of them is that debt interest rate goes up. It costs more to service our debts, which are enormously high, but at the moment our servicing costs are extraordinarily low. That might not continue. Look, on corporation tax rates, if you look overall, as I sort of said earlier, yeah, there was some base broadening. So it depends which sort of sector you're in all honesty. In some places, in some areas, some sectors benefited more from capital allowances than others. Yes, capital allowances were tightened up. The rate fell. Overall, it was a net reduction in corporation tax take. We did put money into it to reduce the rate. It wasn't all about shuffling within the corporate tax system, but yeah, some businesses benefited more than others.
Chris, are you happy for me to move to another question now?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Michael Ledsian from sitting there in Cambridge.
Oh, thank you very much, David and Chris. My question is actually more about the green agenda. So what's the likelihood over the medium term that Rishi Sunak might, or the Chancellor might, bring some sort of incentives or actually just change the tax system to incentivize good green behavior, shall we say? You could really transform the tax system if you wanted to massively incentivize recycling, reducing carbon emissions and stuff like that. Obviously the political consequences to that. So what's the direction of travel, and how might that evolve, given that we really need to do it?
Yeah, I thought it was quite striking. Really, there wasn't that much in there on the green agenda. There was some stuff about the Bank of England's targets and so on, which might objectives, which might prove to be important, but there wasn't very much there. There is this tax day on the 23rd of March, and that might be an opportunity. We don't really know what the Chancellor is going to say on that day, but that might be an opportunity to start to outline an approach to green taxation. It strikes me, if you listen carefully to what Rishi Sunak says, he's very interested in this green agenda, that he does want to take this seriously. I think in terms of sort of repositioning the government and appealing to younger voters, there's a political case for it as well as on the substance of the policy. The challenge, I think, is, again, those red wall voters who be very reluctant to sort of pay more, and so we saw fuel duty frozen again. If you were really looking at ways in which you would incentivize behavior, you could look at VAT on domestic fuel, which is currently at 5%, but I'd be very surprised were they to put that up, especially as we've just had a winter where people were working from home and had the heating on much more and are probably about to get a shock when they see their bills. But I think genuinely Rishi wants to do more on this. It's politically challenging. It creates tensions within the coalition of Conservative supporters. But is he going to say more over the course of the year? I would be surprised if we don't hear a bit more. But I think they're instinctively going to be really quite cautious, because certainly the Prime Minister will want to talk green, but I don't think he'll want it to be carrots, not sticks. And whether they've got the money for generous carrots, it remains to be seen.
Very interesting. Chris, maybe we have one more question.
Yep, go on.
Good. And then we'll come back to you, please. So Daniel Widdicombe.
Hi, David. Thank you, and Chris and Simon. A lot of things over the last few weeks, but it just seems like British business has kind of been left out to dry in the wake of leaving the EU and Brexit, in the sense that you've got the exports to the EU, exporters and manufacturers now really struggling with the new bureaucratic hurdles. And I wondered what you thought could be done, what the Chancellor could do in terms of helping these companies out. It may be that it's a short-term issue, but some of the problems seem to be fairly complex and intractable.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with the point you're making, and a lot of sympathy with those businesses that are now facing barriers to trade that are new and they've been promised wouldn't happen, but they are happening. I think there are limits, in truth, that the government can do in terms of compensating those businesses. You run into state aid issues, even at the WTO level, let alone some of the commitments that remain in place in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So export subsidies or stuff like that, you run into all sorts of difficulties with. The most important thing, in my view, the government could do would be to rebuild a constructive relationship with the European Union. And I don't think it's possible to completely reframe the nature of our relationship. But if we can build up some more trust, if perhaps there are some areas of where we can demonstrate greater flexibility, there might be scope for greater flexibility from the EU as well. Alignment on agricultural goods, I think, might still be something that could be agreed. My worry is that the situation is going to get worse, not better. That the relationship might deteriorate further. The level of trust that exists at the moment, very, very low. There are concerns within the EU that the UK is preparing to walk away from the Northern Ireland Protocol. I'm not sure that is the case. I genuinely don't know whether things are going to get quite that bad. But the fact that is a widely perceived view within the EU suggests that we're not going to be making a lot of progress very quickly. But to answer your question, that is the thing that the government could do quickly, relatively quickly, to improve the situation for those businesses exporting to the EU.
So, Chris, would you like a final word before I thank you?
Well, I was tempted to ask David if after the budget last week, if we're any closer to knowing what Brexit means, but maybe that's a subject for another call entirely. I think what is really interesting, what David has illuminated here, is the real tension at the heart of the Conservative Party, which comes to that point. Indeed, Brexit for some people in the Conservative Party was about low taxes, pro-business, aggressively pro-business approach. But those communities that David talked about, the traditional red wall seats that voted Conservative, that is not their view of it. And it comes to many of the questions we've had here. Michael's really good question about the green agenda. The government, I think Rishi Sunak does believe in this and wants to go further. The Prime Minister does believe in it and wants to go further. But they know they've got to go really, really slowly, because their view, and I think this is a bit of a mischaracterization, but their view is that those communities, those seats, are not on board with a lot of those measures. So what I think we saw last week was, really that unresolved tension about where the Conservative Party is going, where the Conservative government is going. I'm not sure we're that much clearer necessarily about what the long-term view and what Rishi Sunak's long-term view about that might be. So watch this space.
So thank you very much. Thank you, David, for taking time. Chris and Audley, thank you very much indeed for putting all this together. Really appreciate it, and a fascinating conversation, as we knew it would be. So thank you. And we hope very much, David, we might welcome you back another time. And Chris, thank you again. And thank you to the Audley team. And we will see. Oh, I should just mention the next talk on Tuesday of next week will be the first of our literary discussions, when Jessica Fellows will be talking to Daisy Wall. And here she is, a preview. So very good to see you all. Very good to see you all. And we'll hope to see you next Tuesday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.